He was neither warrior nor priest, neither ruler nor mythic hero. And yet, in the dawn of ancient Greece, a solitary figure stands, chiseled from marble, arms by his side, staring forward with a faint, enigmatic smile. He is the Kouros, one of the earliest known Greek statues of the male nude. And, in his stillness, he speaks, not with words but with form, a message in symmetry, material, and gesture. This is not merely a block of stone. It is the beginning of sculpture, as expression, as presence, as a bridge between mortality and something eternal. Before the classical masterpieces, before the emotive spirals of the Hellenistic era, there was this quiet, formal effort to render the human body in stone, crude by later standards, but revolutionary in its time. In those earliest Greek works, from the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, we find something essential, an aspiration to fix the human experience in matter, to give weight and visibility to memory, to ritual, to ideals. These statues, known collectively as kouroi, youths, and korai, maidens, borrowed much from Egyptian prototypes, the rigid stance, the frontal gaze, the arms at the sides, the left foot forward. And yet the Greeks were not content to simply imitate. They were already, even then, experimenting with proportion, with anatomy, with the soul beneath the surface. Where the Egyptians carved for eternity, timeless, changeless, divine, the Greeks would soon carve for movement, for presence, for the life between breaths. The kouros begins as symbol, but becomes study, not merely of the human form, but of its ideal, of what a man or woman should be. Young, balanced, strong, serene. The earliest kouroi, like those from Attica or the Cycladic Islands, are stiff and geometric. The muscles are schematized, the face stylized, the body almost abstract. But as decades pass, the kouroi become more natural, more nuanced. Shoulders soften, hips subtly shift, torsos rotate ever so slightly. The archaic smile, a gentle upward curve of the lips, appears, suggesting not happiness, but aliveness. It is a sign that the sculptor is beginning to see the statue not just as object, but as being. The korai, often clothed in elaborate drapery, evolve similarly. At first, they are dolls in stone, ornamental and restrained. But soon the folds of their garments ripple with realism. Their poses become engaging. They reach outward, or grasp their peplos in a gesture of grace. They begin to occupy space. These statues, often placed on graves or offered at temples, were more than decorative. They were messengers, to gods, to ancestors, to memory itself. They carried names, prayers, dedications. They embodied civic pride, familial honor, and religious devotion. Carved primarily in marble, these early figures also bore paint, though time has stripped away most of it. Their eyes were once outlined, their lips red, their robes vibrant with blues, greens, and golds. They would have gleamed in the Mediterranean sun, alive in color, not the austere white we imagine today. And they stood not in isolation, but in landscape, in sacred groves, on temple terraces, beside city gates. As one approached the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi or the Acropolis of Athens, one walked among a crowd of stone figures, each part of a greater visual narrative. These early works did not strive for individuality as later portraits would. They represented types: youth, maiden, athlete, priestess. But in their forms, the Greeks were beginning a journey that would lead to individuality, narrative, and emotional depth. By the end of the Archaic period, around 480 BCE, the transformation was clear. In one of the most famous funerary sculptures of the era, the so-called Critios boy, we see the full shift. No longer stiff, his body stands with weight on one leg, the other relaxed. His hips tilt, his spine curves, his head turns ever so slightly. This is contrapposto, the stance that would define naturalistic sculpture for the next 2 millennia. With it comes a new realism, a new psychology. The Critios boy is not smiling. He is thinking. He inhabits himself. He is not symbolic. He is human. And in that single turn of the hips, in that subtle change of weight, the Greek sculptor declares a revolution. The statue is no longer merely divine or decorative. It is a reflection of life and of the inner world. Thus, the archaic period ends, and classical sculpture is born. It would bring with it ideals of balance and proportion, of civic virtue and individual glory. But none of that would have been possible without the early experiments, the kouros, the core, the smile that wasn't a smile, but a spark. Greek sculpture began with imitation and arrived at invention. From the stone emerged not just form, but thought. They called it symmetria, not merely symmetry as we know it today, but a balance of parts, a harmony of relationships, an inner rhythm that guided the sculptor's hand as much as it governed the cosmos. It was the foundation of classical Greek sculpture, an age in which the human body became the measure of all things. As Greece moved from the archaic into the classical period around 480 BCE, a shift occurred, not only in politics, with the rise of Athenian democracy, but in art, in thought, in how the Greeks perceived the body and the self. The stiff, formulaic kouroi gave way to fluid forms that breathed, stood, walked, even seemed to contemplate their own existence. At the center of this transformation was the sculptor Polykleitos of Argos, one of the great names of Greek art, whose contribution was not only artistic, but deeply theoretical. He didn't just carve statues. He wrote a treatise, now lost, known simply as the Canon. In it, he set out to define the perfect proportions of the human body using mathematics, ratios, and geometric precision. Though the text itself survives only in fragments and references, its principles live on in his most famous work, the Doriphoros, or spear-bearer. This statue was no portrait, no specific athlete or warrior. It was an ideal, a man at rest and yet prepared, relaxed yet powerful. His weight falls naturally on one leg, creating a gentle S-curve in the body, known as contrapposto. His muscles are defined but not exaggerated. The tilt of the hips corresponds to the angle of the shoulders. The head turns ever so slightly, echoing the rhythm of the limbs. Every part relates to the whole, and the whole to a perfect harmony. To modern eyes, the Doriphoros may seem serene, even subdued, but to the Greeks it was a revelation, the body as geometry, as philosophy, as proof of human potential. Polykleitos's canon was not the only one. Other sculptors pursued different ideals. Myron, with his Discobolus, captured the frozen moment of movement. Phidias, the master behind the colossal statues of Zeus and Athena, brought a sense of divine grandeur. But it was Polykleitos who most clearly fused science with aesthetics, creating a model that would resonate through Roman art, the Renaissance, and beyond. The classical sculptors were not interested in the real body as it appeared in daily life, with blemishes, asymmetries, aging, or fatigue. Instead, they pursued a refined reality, the body as it might be at its most balanced, its most beautiful, its most noble, youthful, poised, strong. This was not mere vanity, it was philosophical. The Greeks saw the body as a reflection of inner virtue. A well-proportioned form signified not only physical fitness, but moral and civic excellence, what they called kalokagathia, the union of beauty and goodness. Nudity, far from being scandalous, was a language of values. The nude male figure was used not just for gods and athletes, but for heroes, citizens, and even personifications of abstract virtues. It was not erotic so much as aspirational, a vision of what man could be when shaped by discipline, training, and reason. Clothed figures, often female, were no less studied. The drapery itself became a canvas for sculptural virtuosity. In statues like the Aphrodite of the Agora or the Nike adjusting her sandal, folds of cloth cling to the body like wet silk, revealing the form beneath while maintaining modesty. The play of light across these folds animated the marble, creating movement, depth, and sensuality without revealing bare skin. To achieve such lifelike and balanced forms, sculptors employed carefully honed techniques. Marble, the favored material, was quarried from places like Paros and Naxos, prized for its fine grain and luminous quality. The stone was worked with chisels, drills, rasps, and abrasives, often starting from a rough block, using pointing tools, and moving gradually to finer details. Measurements were taken not just by eye, but with wooden calipers, plumb bobs, and string grids. Sculptors developed proportional systems, such as using the head as a unit of measure, often rendering the body as 7 heads tall, or even 8 in later periods, for a more elegant appearance. Sculptures were not finished in white. As in earlier periods, they were painted, hair, eyes, lips, and garments brought to life with natural pigments. Bronze works, which were also common but less likely to survive, allowed for even finer details and more dynamic poses, with extended limbs and flowing drapery. The classical period blurred the lines between gods and mortals, often portraying divine figures with human realism and humans with divine poise. The gods became ideal humans, and humans, in their excellence, could approach divinity. This dual vision is evident in the massive statues that adorned sanctuaries. Perhaps the most famous were the Athena Parthenos by Phidias, housed in the Parthenon, and the Zeus at Olympia, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Both were made with a technique known as chryselephantine, combining gold and ivory over a wooden core. These statues were not only artistic triumphs, they were statements of civic pride, religious devotion, and political power. Phidias Athena stood nearly 12 meters tall, armed and radiant, a symbol of Athenian strength. Zeus, seated on his throne, exuded calm authority, his presence filling the vast temple like a vision of the divine itself. Yet even in these exalted works, the human form remained central. Gods were not monsters or abstractions. They were recognizable, relatable, inhabiting perfected bodies that echoed the viewer's own form, only more serene, more complete. By the end of the 5th century BCE, the principles of classical sculpture, balance, proportion, naturalism, and idealization, had become codified. They were not just artistic choices, but expressions of a world view, that order and reason governed the universe, that man was a rational and moral being, and that beauty and truth were intimately linked. Sculpture became a tool for expressing philosophy in form. It embodied the ideals of democracy, virtue, and humanism. And while styles would continue to evolve, the canon of Polykleitos and the classical vision would remain a benchmark, imitated, challenged, and rediscovered across millennia. From the rigid kouros to the poised doriphoros, Greek sculpture had discovered not only how to carve a body, but how to suggest consciousness, identity, and purpose in stone. To the modern eye, the statues of ancient Greece appear austere, white marble, clean lines, stripped of embellishment, the very definition of classical restraint. But this vision is an illusion, a product of time, erosion, and romantic imagination. In reality, Greek statues were once vibrant with color, painted in hues both subtle and vivid, a sensory experience meant to animate the stone and bring gods and mortals into dazzling presence. This practice is known as polychromy, the application of multiple colors to sculpture, and it was not a marginal detail, but a central aesthetic feature of ancient sculpture across centuries. The loss of pigment over millennia created a false perception of Greek ideals as monochrome and minimalistic. In truth, Greek artists were not afraid of color. They embraced it boldly, systematically, and with purpose. For much of the 18th and 19th centuries, European collectors, artists, and scholars believed that the white marble of Greek and Roman statuary represented a deliberate aesthetic ideal: purity, order, perfection without adornment. Classical sculpture, in this view, was about form alone, free from the distraction of color. This belief shaped Western art, especially during the neoclassical movement, when artists like Canova and Thorvaldsen emulated what they thought were the unpainted principles of antiquity. Museums arranged their halls with rows of pristine white statues, echoing this myth of noble simplicity. But archaeological discoveries gradually dismantled this notion. Traces of pigment on hair, eyes, lips, clothing began to appear on ancient fragments. Chemical analyses, ultraviolet light, and high-resolution imaging revealed microscopic residues of blue, red, gold, green, and black. It became clear the Greeks had painted their statues, sometimes lavishly. Reproductions based on this evidence, such as those by archaeologist Vinzenz Brinkmann and his team, show startling reconstructions: a Kouros with red lips and patterned tunic, an Athena with golden trim and blue robes, a lion's mane rendered in deep ochre. These reconstructions shocked many viewers. The statues looked garish, even gaudy, too much for those accustomed to minimalism. But this discomfort says more about modern taste than ancient aesthetics. To the Greeks, color was not decoration, it was meaning. Colors in Greek sculpture were symbolic and functional. They helped differentiate garments, distinguish skin tones, indicate divine attributes, and suggest motion or hierarchy. For example, skin. Male figures often had reddish or bronze-toned skin, while female figures were rendered with lighter pigments, echoing societal ideals of indoor and thus paler femininity. Eyes and hair. Painted eyes gave the statue a sense of gaze and presence. Hair could be dark, golden, or adorned with colored bands, signaling youth, status, or divinity. Garments, patterns, zigzags, floral designs, borders were intricately painted on drapery, giving texture and life to otherwise smooth stone. Accessories, Jewelry, weapons, sandals, and belts were often gilded or painted to stand out. Details like wreaths, necklaces, or earrings were highlighted with metallic or vibrant hues. Color was also used to create illusionistic effects, to suggest transparency in garments, to simulate the texture of wool or linen, to mimic embroidered borders. It complemented the sculptural form, emphasizing muscles, folds, or emotional intensity. For bronze sculptures, inlays of copper and silver were used to highlight lips, nipples, or eyes, and additional surface treatments created varying finishes: shiny hair, matte skin, gleaming weapons. Color played a particularly important role in religious statuary. Statues of gods were not only idealized human forms, they were living embodiments, focal points for worship and ritual. Color helped make them real, even magical. The colossal statue of Athena Parthenos by Phidias, for instance, was made of gold and ivory, but even beyond the precious materials, it would have been richly colored. Her robes bright, her shield adorned with painted mythological scenes, her eyes inlaid, her sandals intricate. Worshippers entering the Parthenon would not see blank white marble. They would see a divine presence, aglow with sacred color and symbolic detail. In cult contexts, statues were often dressed, crowned, and perfumed as part of ritual. The paint made them more than images. It made them entities, intermediaries, participants in the divine drama. The process of painting statues required skill and knowledge. Artists used natural pigments, ground minerals like azurite for blue, cinnabar for red, malachite for green, and bound them with waxes, egg tempera, or resins. The pigments were applied to smoothed, sometimes polished surfaces, and finished with glazes or gilding. Some areas were painted with fine detail, such as eyelashes, embroidery, or fingernails, while others had broad washes of color. Relief sculpture was also painted, often using shadow and highlight to enhance the illusion of depth. Painters and sculptors often worked in tandem or in specialized workshops. In some cases, a statue was completed and delivered in white, only to be painted later in situ. In others, the painting was integrated into the sculptor's original vision. Statues could also be repainted over time, especially those used in festivals or public rituals. Just as buildings were maintained and refreshed, so too were their sculptural adornments. The gradual erosion of polychromy, due to weathering, burial, fire, and time, created the false narrative of the colorless ideal. By the Roman era, many older Greek statues were already faded, and by the Renaissance, only the bare marble remained. Artists like Michelangelo or Winkelmann embraced this whiteness as purity, not knowing what had been lost. Today, the recovery of polychromy forces us to reimagine Greek art. It challenges long-standing assumptions about Western aesthetics, about what is classical, tasteful, or refined, and it opens the door to a richer, more dynamic understanding of ancient creativity. Greek sculpture was never cold. It was warm, radiant, and alive with color, a synthesis of shape and hue, form and feeling. It was not meant to be admired at a distance, in silence. It was meant to dazzle, to speak, to be present in the world of gods and mortals alike. As the classical period matured, Greek sculpture began to shift, from the ideal to the intimate, from abstraction to emotion. The body remained central, still shaped by the canons of proportion and symmetry, but the gaze of the artist turned inward. No longer content with perfect stillness or restrained harmony, sculptors began to explore the nuances of personality, the tensions of movement, and the poetry of the everyday. This evolution was not abrupt, but it is often marked by two names whose influence would echo through history: Praxiteles and Lysippos. These two sculptors, working in the 4th century BCE, each redefined the possibilities of form and feeling in marble and bronze. Their work represented a new chapter, not a rejection of classical ideals, but their humanization. Praxiteles is perhaps most famous for his Aphrodite of Knidos, a statue that broke boundaries in both subject and sensibility. For the first time in major public sculpture, a female deity was rendered completely nude. This was not merely a technical challenge, it was a cultural statement. The Aphrodite is not overtly erotic. She stands in a moment of privacy, perhaps caught just before or after bathing, her hand drawn modestly to her groin, in a gesture both covering and accentuating. Her head tilts gently. Her weight falls softly on one leg. Her body, though proportioned and symmetrical, is imbued with a living softness, a gentle melancholy, as though she exists in thought, not just form. Viewers at the time were struck not just by the novelty of the nude female figure, but by the emotion it evoked. The statue became so famous that people traveled great distances to see it. Copies multiplied. Poets wrote about her. She was no longer simply a representation of a goddess. She was presence, a sculpted sigh. Praxiteles' genius lay in his ability to breathe vulnerability into stone. His work seemed to move inward, to suggest inner life. Whether sculpting Hermes, cradling the infant Dionysus, or youthful satyrs in drowsy repose, he rendered gods and mortals alike with a sense of gentle reflection, of delicate imperfection. Where Praxiteles softened form, Lysippos extended it. He was court sculptor to Alexander the Great, and a man of boundless energy and innovation. Lysippos claimed he did not depict men as they were, but as they appeared, an important distinction. He abandoned the Polycletan canon of symmetry, and instead lengthened limbs, narrowed the torso, and twisted the body into more dynamic, lifelike poses. His figures turn, reach, stride, and seem to stretch beyond the bounds of the plinth. They demand to be viewed in the round, from all angles, creating a dialogue between space and form. His most famous work, now lost but known through Roman copies, was the Apoxyomenos, the scraper, a young athlete removing oil and sweat from his body with a strigil. The pose is natural, fleeting, caught in the midst of a mundane action. The limbs cross, the head turns, the balance is off-center. Yet in that off-balance moment lies its strength. The sculpture is alive in time, not simply fixed in eternity. Lysippos also sculpted portraits, especially of Alexander. These were not generic heroics, but individualized, reflecting the flame of ambition in the young king's gaze, the tilt of his neck, the tousled leonine hair. It was portraiture as psychological insight, and it marked the beginnings of a new tradition that would flourish in Roman art. Together, Praxiteles and Lysippos represent a deepening of artistic purpose. The classical ideals of harmony and proportion remained, but they were now vehicles for emotion, for narrative, for personality. The statues seemed to inhabit themselves, no longer merely anatomical studies or divine icons. Other artists followed their lead. Sculptures began to show aging, fatigue, playfulness, even humor. Gods reclined on couches, nymphs fled in surprise, athletes stooped in exhaustion. Art was no longer only about the exceptional moment. It was about the human moment. Even scale became more varied. Intimate statues were created for private homes and gardens. Smaller bronzes became collectible objects. Relief sculpture explored scenes of domesticity, children at play, women weaving, families embracing. The emotional range of sculpture expanded. Viewers were not only awed, but touched. This turn toward intimacy did not arise in a vacuum. The 4th century BCE was a time of political upheaval and philosophical ferment. Athens had suffered defeat in the Peloponnesian War. Socrates had been executed. Plato and Aristotle were reshaping thought itself. In this atmosphere of questioning and redefinition, it is no surprise that art turned inward. The body was no longer just a vehicle for expressing civic virtue. It became a site of inquiry, of emotion, of reflection. What does it mean to be divine, to be human, to be seen? Sculpture responded by embracing ambiguity and complexity. The result was a visual language that could whisper as well as proclaim, that could invite rather than impress. This would set the stage for the next great era of sculpture, the Hellenistic period, where all these elements would be magnified into high drama, emotional turmoil, and theatrical realism. But the seeds were planted here, in the quiet elegance of a reclining satyr, in the twist of a strigil, in the wistful gaze of a goddess stepping from her bath. The classical world had not lost its ideals. It had simply learned to feel them more deeply. In the stillness of a graveyard, a marble stele rises. On its surface, 2 figures meet, a seated woman and a standing servant or family member. Their hands almost touch, their eyes meet, or nearly. It is a moment frozen not in grandeur or triumph, but in farewell. No inscription is needed, the emotion is clear. This is Greek funerary sculpture at its finest, poised between presence and absence, the living and the lost, memory and stone. By the late classical period, the art of sculpture had moved beyond temples and agoras to embrace a deeply personal function, to mark, mourn, and eternalize the dead. Grave reliefs became common in cemeteries like those along the Street of the Tombs in Athens, where rows of stelae told silent stories of lives lived and left behind. These works were not monuments of power or victory, but quiet elegies, sculpted with restraint and profound humanity. They represent one of the most intimate uses of sculpture in ancient Greece, where the medium served to preserve identity, relationship, and remembrance. Early Greek graves were marked by simple markers, geometric vases, stone slabs, or carved kouroi and korai that symbolized youth and virtue. But by the 5th and 4th centuries, BCE, funerary sculpture took on a narrative dimension. Reliefs showed scenes from daily life, a man handing his servant a scroll, a woman adjusting her veil, a family group in farewell. The poses were subtle, the gestures modest, yet within their quietness there was depth. These scenes were not intended to represent the moment of death. Rather, they depicted life remembered, often idealized. The deceased is shown calm, dignified, and engaged, as they would be in the prime of life. In this way, the relief acted as a bridge between memory and presence, allowing the viewer to maintain a connection with the departed. The technical execution of these reliefs was exquisite. Drapery clings to the form with a grace that reveals the body beneath, while maintaining decorum. Hands are carved with delicacy, often reaching out in a gesture of parting or connection. The facial expressions are subdued, No overt grief, only serenity, a distant gaze, as though the figures understand their departure, but accept it. Funerary sculpture offers invaluable insight into the social roles and expectations of ancient Greeks. Women are often shown seated, representing their role as nurturers of the household, while men may be depicted standing, offering tokens or holding symbols of public life, scrolls, weapons, or tools. Children appear too, sometimes in the arms of their parents, sometimes alone. The presence of a dog at their feet or a bird in their hand adds a tender realism. Even servants or attendants may be included, a sign of the deceased's social status, but also a reflection of lifelong relationships. These sculptures reflect not just grief, but social continuity. To be remembered in stone was to maintain honor, to affirm one's place in the collective memory of family and city. The inscriptions, when present, are brief. A name, a father's name, perhaps a simple phrase, farewell. We remember. The sculpture did the rest. Most funerary sculptures were carved in Pentelic or Parian marble, prized for its smoothness and luminous quality. The reliefs were often set into rectangular slabs or stelae, sometimes crowned with an architectural element, a pediment, an acroterion, or a gable roof. Occasionally, full statues would be erected, a seated woman, a standing youth, a warrior. These works were originally painted, like other Greek sculptures. The background might be colored blue or red, garments painted with patterns, hair and eyes filled with pigment. In some cases, gold leaf was applied to jewelry or accessories. Over time, the colors faded and the bare marble remains, but the presence of polychromy added life and richness to the original viewing experience. The sculptures were placed along roads leading out of cities, in cemeteries that were public yet personal, where passers-by might pause, reflect, or even speak to the stone. Greek funerary art was not only about the individual, it was about the role of remembrance in society. The dead were honored not with lavish afterlife promises, but with commemoration in the here and now. The reliefs didn't show heavens or underworlds. They showed this world, rendered with love and fidelity. The act of sculpting a grave relief was an act of resistance to forgetting. In a world where life was uncertain, where plagues, war, and childbirth took lives early, these sculptures affirmed endurance. They gave the dead a face, a form, and a gesture of parting. And they were not meant to shock or overwhelm. There were no shrieks, no dramatic gestures, no open wounds, only a touch, a gaze, a seated figure turning away, as if rising to another realm. This restraint makes them more powerful. They allow the viewer to feel their own emotion, to bring their own memory to the stone. They are not monuments to death, but to the act of remembering. In the evolution of sculpture, these grave reliefs mark a profound moment, when art, freed from the constraints of gods and ideals, became a vessel for personal sorrow, quiet beauty, and the unspoken language of farewell. Among the bustling streets of Athens, beneath the watchful shadow of the Acropolis, stood a world carved in marble. Figures of gods, heroes, legislators, and personifications of virtues adorned the open spaces of the agora, the heart of civic life. Nearby, within the serene and sacred confines of temples, stood statues not merely to be seen, but to be worshipped, revered, and communed with. These two realms, the public and the sacred, formed the principal domains in which sculpture shaped the everyday reality of the ancient Greek world. Greek sculpture, in these contexts, was more than decoration. It was civic architecture, religious instrument, moral guide, and public memory. It spoke to the values of the community, the protection of the gods, and the glory of the city-state. It was, in essence, a visible constitution, a code of identity, belief, and aspiration, carved in enduring stone and gleaming bronze. The agora was not only a market, it was the civic, judicial, and philosophical center of the polis. It was here that sculpture played a didactic and symbolic role, reinforcing communal values, recording historical events, and providing visual reference points in the shared cultural consciousness. Statues of lawgivers, like Solon and Lycurgus, reminded citizens of their legal foundations. Honored generals, such as Miltiades or Themistocles, stood as guardians of democracy and military virtue. Tyrannicides, like Harmodius and Aristogeiton, famously honored in bronze, represented resistance to tyranny and the sanctity of civic freedom. These statues were often sponsored by the state, sometimes by private donors. They were placed not at random, but with intention, at intersections, before government buildings, at ceremonial entrances. The positioning created dialogues between statues and between citizens and their ideals. Inscriptions on their bases offered names, achievements, and dedications. Some included epigrams, short poems of praise or commemoration. Others served as warnings or models of exemplary behavior. The sculpture of the agora was a visual curriculum, reminding Athenians of what it meant to be part of the polis. There were also personifications, sculptures of democracy, dike, justice, arete, virtue, or Nike, victory. These abstract ideas were rendered in human form, accessible and idealized, transforming philosophy into presence. Sculptors competed not just in technique, but in meaning. A well-placed gesture, a turn of the head, a detail of drapery, each carried moral resonance. The city itself became a museum of values, where art and politics walked hand in hand. If the agora was the realm of communal values, the temple was the space of divine encounter. Sculpture here served a different purpose. It was not illustrative, but invocational. The statue of a god or goddess was not merely symbolic. It was, in many cases, an embodiment of the deity, a site of actual presence. These cult statues varied in scale, from modest stone figures in local shrines to colossal works like the Athena Parthenos in Athens or the Zeus at Olympia, both by Phidias. These were not sculptures to be touched or even seen up close. They loomed in shadowed interiors, revealed by flickering torchlight and perfumed by incense, made sacred by ritual. The Athena Parthenos, for instance, was over 11 meters tall, crafted in chryselephantine, gold and ivory, over a wooden frame. She stood armed, helmeted, and radiant, her shield and aegis decorated with scenes of mythic battle. Her very materials, gold, ivory, wood, spoke of wealth, devotion, and divine grandeur. The Zeus at Olympia, similarly monumental, was seated, but no less majestic. His throne was adorned with scenes of gods and mortals. In one hand, he held a figure of Nike, in the other, a scepter topped with an eagle. His face was serene, his gaze eternal. Pilgrims came from across the Greek world to behold him. He was a world wonder, not just for size, but for majesty. These sacred sculptures were the focus of prayer, offerings, and festivals. They were clothed in robes, anointed with oils, and paraded in processions. They were not inert, they were alive in ritual. Temple sculpture was not confined to the cult image inside. It adorned the very structure of the building, on pediments, metopes, and friezes. These sculpted decorations narrated the myths and legends of the gods, anchoring divine stories in architectural form. The Parthenon, again, offers the finest example. Its east pediment depicted the birth of Athena from the head of Zeus. The west, the contest between Athena and Poseidon for the city of Athens. The metopes showed scenes of battle, Lapiths versus centaurs, Greeks versus Amazons, gods versus giants. The frieze, a continuous band around the inner colonnade, portrayed the Panathenaic procession, linking myth to civic ritual. These sculptural programs served both aesthetic and theological purposes. They reinforced the sanctity of the temple, reminded worshippers of the god's power, and created a cosmic order in stone. Temple sculpture required coordination between architects, sculptors, and painters. The scale was vast, the placement high and angled. Figures had to be legible from below in varying light. Relief depth was adjusted to create optical correction. Sculptures were carved deeper or tilted slightly forward to appear natural when viewed from the ground. Figures were often carved in situ, adjusted to fit the architectural space. The anatomy, composition, and emotional expression had to balance with the rhythms of column and cornice. Colors were used here too, blues, reds, and golds on garments, backgrounds, and details. Eyes were painted, weapons gilded, inscriptions highlighted. The result was not monochrome solemnity, but a vivid, active environment, teeming with gods, stories, and meaning. Despite their different functions, the agora and the temple were not separate worlds. They formed a continuum, one public, the other sacred, of sculptural expression. Citizens moved from civic assemblies to religious festivals, from the law court to the altar. Sculpture accompanied them, instructed them, inspired them. In this synthesis, Greek sculpture reached a unique balance. It was at once art, message, and presence. It could glorify the state, honor the individual, invite the divine, and comfort the bereaved, all in the same visual language. And through it all, the sculptor remained both artisan and philosopher, shaping not only bodies, but worldviews, helping generations of Greeks see who they were and who they might become. In the centuries that followed Alexander the Great's conquests, Greek sculpture experienced a dramatic transformation, one marked by movement, drama, and raw emotion. This was the Hellenistic period, a time when art no longer served only the state, the gods, or the idealized citizen, but increasingly reflected the human condition in all its beauty and turmoil. It was a period of artistic expansion that matched the geographic and cultural vastness of the new Hellenistic world. The sculptures of this era do not stand in serene contrapposto with tranquil expressions. They strain, twist, weep, struggle, and cry out. Muscles bulge, brows furrow, bodies collapse or rise in defiance. The goal was not harmony. It was intensity, immediacy, immersion. The Hellenistic sculptor sought to make the viewer feel, not just admire. With Alexander's empire stretching from Greece to Egypt, Persia, and India, a vast fusion of cultures took root. Cities like Alexandria, Pergamon, Antioch, and Rhodes became centers of learning, science, and art. Greek sculptors traveled, learned new techniques, absorbed new aesthetics, and responded to diverse audiences. In this context, sculpture became more inclusive and exploratory, no longer limited to gods, athletes, or citizens. Subjects now included foreigners, old age, children, animals, and the grotesque. The range of emotional expression exploded. The art of this period reflects the dynamism of its world, no longer the small, ordered polis, but a sprawling, sometimes chaotic international stage. Sculpture responded with a theatricality never before seen in the classical world. One of the most powerful works from this period is the Dying Gaul, a Roman copy of a Greek original created in Pergamon. The statue depicts a barbarian warrior, fallen, bleeding, yet dignified. His hair is wild, his face twisted in pain, his body collapsing under its own weight. But there is no caricature. His expression is noble. He suffers, but he is not humiliated. This statue marked a new attitude in sculpture, the dignified portrayal of the enemy. It was a reminder of both the glory of victory and the humanity of the defeated. Such empathy in sculpture had no precedent in the earlier periods. Perhaps the most iconic work of Hellenistic sculpture is the Laocoon group, now in the Vatican museums. It shows the Trojan priest Laocoon and his two sons being strangled by sea serpents, a punishment sent by the gods. The composition is a storm in marble. Bodies writhe in a spiral of limbs and torsion. Faces scream in pain. Every muscle is activated, every sinew stretched. The viewer feels not just the narrative, but the suffering. This was sculpture as high drama, not only in subject, but in form. The figures are deeply undercut, designed to cast dynamic shadows. The composition twists in space, meant to be viewed from multiple angles. It is sculpture that does not rest. It acts. Not all Hellenistic sculpture was tragic. Much of it was observational, focusing on the real lives of ordinary people. Statues of fishermen, old women, drunken satyrs, sleeping children, and playful erotes show a world rich in texture and specificity. The so-called old market woman is one such piece, a wrinkled, hunched figure carrying a basket of fruit. Her face is gaunt, her body frail, her clothes disheveled. This was not beauty in the classical sense, but truth in the human sense. Portraiture also flourished in this era, especially in Egypt under the Ptolemies. Individual features, age lines, even deformities were rendered with accuracy. The goal was no longer to idealize, but to represent, and, through representation, to honor. Hellenistic sculptors reveled in technical innovation. Marble and bronze were pushed to new limits. Figures were shown in flight, suspended on a single point, or captured in complex postures. Statues like the Nike of Samothrace, a winged victory figure poised on a ship's prow, combined movement, fabric, wind, and space into a single triumphant gesture. Her garments ripple in imagined wind, her wings flare, her torso twists. She was meant to be seen from below, approached from an angle, surrounded by light and water. The statue is interactive in the deepest sense. It demands not just viewing, but experiencing. The sleeping Hermaphroditus, another famous Hellenistic sculpture, invites surprise and ambiguity. Seen from behind, the figure appears to be a reclining female nude, but upon circling, the viewer discovers male anatomy. The sculptor plays with perception, gender, and expectation, revealing the sophistication of Hellenistic thought. Hellenistic sculpture often adorned public theatres, gymnasia, libraries, and fountains. It was part of a performative urban fabric where citizens encountered art not only in temples or homes, but in motion, in civic life. Colossal statues also appeared in this period, the most famous being the Colossus of Rhodes, a bronze figure of the sun god Helios, said to have stood over 30 meters tall. Though it no longer survives, its legend reflects the ambition of Hellenistic artists and patrons. At the same time, smaller bronzes proliferated in homes and sanctuaries. Sculptors now worked across scales, media, and emotions. The result was a body of art that was as diverse as the world it mirrored. More than any other period, Hellenistic sculpture embraced emotion as a source of power. Joy, sorrow, ecstasy, fear, exhaustion, all became sculptable states. Viewers were not merely meant to admire the form, they were meant to be moved, even overwhelmed. This change reflects not only artistic evolution, but a philosophical and psychological shift. The classical world sought perfection. The Hellenistic world embraced experience. By the time the Romans absorbed and adapted Greek art, this theatrical realism had become a dominant mode of expression. It would persist, altered, revived, and reinterpreted through Roman sculpture, medieval icons, and Renaissance masterpieces. But its origin was here, in the windswept drama of Samothrace, the anguished twist of Laocoon, and the quiet dignity of a dying warrior. Greek sculpture had grown, from the ideal to the emotional, from the eternal to the immediate. It had become, in the fullest sense, human. As Greek political power waned and Rome's influence surged across the Mediterranean, a profound cultural exchange unfolded, one in which sculpture became a bridge between civilizations. The Romans, ever pragmatic, admired the artistic mastery of the Greeks and sought not only to collect Greek art, but to absorb it, replicate it, and surpass it. In the process, Roman sculpture evolved into a complex tradition of adaptation and innovation, blending the idealism of Greece with the realism and statecraft of Roman society. This chapter marks the turning point where Greek forms were recontextualized to serve a new empire, an empire that used sculpture as both a mirror of its values and a tool of its politics. Roman aristocrats, generals, and emperors were voracious collectors of Greek art. Conquests in the eastern Mediterranean brought tens of thousands of Greek sculptures to Rome. Temples, villas, and public buildings were filled with statues taken from Athens, Pergamon, Corinth, and Rhodes. Soon, the demand for Greek-style art exceeded the supply. A vibrant industry of copyists emerged, often Greek sculptors themselves, working in Roman cities, creating marble versions of lost bronze originals, or variations on classical and Hellenistic themes. It is because of these Roman copies that we know many of the masterpieces of Greek sculpture, such as Polykleitos Doryphoros, spear-bearer, Myron's Discobolus, discus thrower, Praxiteles Aphrodite of Knidos, Lysippos Apoxyomenos, the scraper. Roman copies were not always exact. They sometimes altered proportions, added clothing, or modified facial expressions to suit Roman tastes, yet they were revered as cultural treasures and served to anchor Roman identity in the legacy of Greece. To own a Greek statue, or even a copy, was to possess status, education, and refinement. While Roman sculpture began by emulating Greek models, it quickly developed its own distinctive language, especially in portraiture. The Romans valued verism, a style of hyperrealism that emphasized the individuality of the subject, including age lines, wrinkles, scars, and imperfections. This style was particularly prominent in Republican portraiture, where the busts of senators and elders were celebrated for their grizzled honesty. These were not idealized youths. They were men who had endured war, held office, survived crisis. Their faces were biographies in stone. Such portraits adorned family shrines, were carried in funerals, and used to link ancestry to civic virtue. In this way, sculpture served not just aesthetic, but ancestral and political functions. Later, under the emperors, portraiture became more idealized again, blending realism with divine symbolism. Emperors were shown as timeless and youthful, yet still recognizable. The statue of Augustus of Prima Porta, for instance, combines the calm contrapposto of Greek art with political iconography, his armor depicting scenes of Roman triumph, and Cupid at his feet, linking him to the goddess Venus. This fusion of individual, ideal, and divine became the hallmark of imperial portraiture. Roman sculpture also innovated in narrative relief, a form not prominent in earlier Greek art. Monumental friezes told complex stories across spiraling columns, triumphal arches, and altars. The most famous example is the Column of Trajan, completed in 113 CE. Winding up its 30-meter shaft is a continuous frieze over 200 meters in length, depicting the emperor's campaign against the Dacians in vivid detail. Soldiers march, engineers build bridges, enemies surrender, and battles unfold. The emperor appears dozens of times, not as myth, but as leader and strategist. Other monuments, such as the Arch of Titus, celebrated military victories with reliefs showing Roman legions looting the Temple of Jerusalem, carrying the menorah through the streets of Rome. These reliefs served as visual propaganda, reinforcing imperial authority and national pride. Roman sculpture was thus not only about form, it was about function. It communicated power, piety, prestige, and permanence. Roman sculpture permeated not only public spaces, but private life. Wealthy households adorned their villas with statues of gods, philosophers, and mythological figures. Gardens, atriums, and dining rooms became galleries of culture, often filled with busts of ancestors or reproductions of Greek nudes. In tombs, reliefs and sarcophagi depicted scenes from daily life, epic tales, or philosophical allegories. The Portonaccio sarcophagus, for example, shows a chaotic battle scene in high relief, with horses rearing, soldiers locked in combat, and the deceased portrayed as a heroic commander. Children, couples, freedmen, and enslaved people were all commemorated in stone, creating a rich archive of Roman life and belief. While Greek sculpture was primarily in bronze and marble, Roman sculptors worked with a broader range of materials: porphyry, limestone, alabaster, and painted plaster. Marble was imported in vast quantities from across the empire. Carrara in Italy, Pentelic from Greece, Proconnesus from Asia Minor. Technical innovations included drilling tools that allowed for deeper undercuts and greater shadow play. Portraiture, in particular, benefited from these techniques, with intricate curls of hair, beards, and garments rendered with tactile realism. Paint continued to play a role, though few traces survive. In some cases, sculptures had glass eyes, bronze eyelashes, or inlaid teeth. Many statues, especially in domestic contexts, were vividly polychromed. Roman artisans often worked in large teams, with master sculptors overseeing apprentices and workshops. Inscriptions sometimes name these artists, though many remain anonymous. Their skill helped define not only Roman visual culture, but the preservation of Greek legacy. As Christianity emerged and Rome began to transform, sculpture again shifted purpose. Pagan temples fell into disuse. Emperors became divinized, then demonized, then forgotten. By the late Empire, the clarity and realism of classical sculpture gave way to abstraction, symbolism, and spiritual stylization. Yet through all its changes, Roman sculpture never ceased to communicate power and presence. It redefined what sculpture could be, not just an art, but a political and historical document. It also laid the foundation for what would come next. Though many Roman sculptures would be destroyed, buried, or repurposed, the fragments that survived became the textbooks of the Renaissance, the inspiration of Michelangelo, Bernini, and countless others. Through Roman eyes, we inherited Greek form. Through Roman hands, the sculpture of antiquity became immortal. As the Roman Empire entered its twilight and Christianity rose from the margins to the mainstream, the function and meaning of sculpture changed profoundly. What had once been the art of presence and power, whether in the service of gods, heroes, or emperors, became, in the hands of early Christians and medieval artisans, a vehicle of faith, symbolism, and spiritual guidance. The transition from classical to Christian sculpture was not immediate or uniform, but it marked a profound transformation in the way humans used carved form, no longer to glorify the human body, but to elevate the soul. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the Roman world was in flux. As Christianity spread and imperial stability crumbled, classical artistic traditions, especially sculpture's naturalism, began to erode. The focus shifted from anatomical perfection and realistic space to didactic clarity, hierarchical scale, and symbolic abstraction. Figures lost their classical proportions. Faces grew larger and more solemn. Bodies became stylized, more rigid and frontal. The naturalism that had once celebrated movement and anatomy was now seen as distracting or worldly. What mattered was not how lifelike a figure appeared, but how effectively it conveyed a divine or sacred truth. This was not a regression in skill, but a reorientation in purpose. Sculpture was no longer about capturing the material world. It was about pointing beyond it. In the catacombs of Rome, Christian communities buried their dead, not with monumental statuary, but with symbolic imagery. The Good Shepherd, the fish, the anchor, the chairo. These were visual codes, understood by the faithful and hidden in plain sight. As Christianity gained legal recognition and imperial patronage under Constantine the Great, sculpture found new prominence in churches, tombs, and public monuments. Sarcophagi, especially, became canvases for biblical stories rendered in low relief. One notable example is the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus, 359 CE, carved with scenes from the Old and New Testaments, Adam and Eve, Daniel in the lion's den, Christ before Pilate. The figures are still somewhat classical in form, but their gestures are hieratic, their space shallow, their scale driven by theological importance rather than physical realism. The goal was not to mirror the world, but to teach and sanctify. The stories carved in stone served as visual scripture for an audience that was largely illiterate. Sculpture faced major theological challenges during the Byzantine era. Some Christians, especially in the East, viewed graven images with suspicion or outright hostility. The fear was that statues could lead to idolatry, a breach of the commandment against making images. This tension erupted in the iconoclast controversy, 8th to 9th centuries CE, during which many sculptures and mosaics were destroyed or defaced. The debate was not about art as craft, but about art as theology. Could divine truth be represented in material form? While flat images, icons and mosaics eventually regained theological legitimacy, freestanding sculpture in the round largely disappeared from Byzantine religious life. What survived were reliefs, carved ivories, and architectural sculpture, flattened, frontal, and symbolic. In the West, where the papacy maintained a different doctrinal stance, sculpture continued, though still shaped by the demands of Christian piety and medieval cosmology. By the 11th century, sculpture began to flourish again in Western Europe, particularly on the facades of Romanesque churches. Unlike the naturalistic statues of antiquity, these figures were elongated, hieratic, and often fearsome. The goal was to awe and instruct. The tympanum, semicircular area above church doors, became a favoured site for large narrative reliefs. These often depicted the Last Judgment, with Christ in majesty at the centre, flanked by saints, angels, and the saved, while demons dragged the damned into hell on the periphery. Famous examples include Autumn Cathedral, carved by Gislebertus, whose tympanum shows a dramatic and deeply emotive judgment scene; Moissac Abbey, with its writhing figures and apocalyptic visions. These works were not subtle. They were intended to terrify, instruct, and inspire repentance. Figures were distorted, gestures exaggerated, space collapsed into layers of symbolic meaning. This was not about beauty. It was about truth, urgency, and salvation. Sculpture moved from the tomb to the threshold, serving as a visual sermon for all who entered. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the Gothic style brought a renewed interest in naturalism, though within the bounds of Christian doctrine. Cathedrals like Chartres, Reims, and Amiens featured thousands of sculpted figures. Prophets, apostles, martyrs, and kings, now more lifelike, individualized, and gently expressive. The Gothic sculptor began to explore human emotion, graceful drapery, and movement once again. The statues adorning portals and column capitals became stories in stone, not only of heaven and hell, but of virtue and vice, daily life, and redemption. Saints were portrayed with gentle faces. The Virgin Mary became increasingly tender and maternal. Even the Christ figure softened from the stern judge of the Romanesque to the suffering Saviour, inviting compassion rather than only fear. In this period, sculpture once again served not just to instruct, but to move the soul. By the late Middle Ages, the seeds of a new transformation were being planted, one that would revisit the glories of Greek and Roman art, not to revive their gods, but to rediscover their humanity. In Italy, especially in Florence, sculptors began to study ancient ruins, measure statues, and copy reliefs. They no longer feared the nude human form. They questioned proportions, experimented with perspective, and sought to reconcile faith with classical reason. This would give birth to a new era, the Renaissance, where sculpture would again celebrate the body, not as vanity, but as the vessel of divine spark. Before reaching that peak, sculpture had walked through centuries of transformation, where bodies grew rigid to guard the soul, where truth mattered more than flesh, and where even the simplest figure could speak volumes about faith, eternity, and the path beyond the grave. When the Renaissance dawned in Italy, sculpture stood at the threshold of a profound rebirth. The Middle Ages had never entirely extinguished its flame, but now that flame blazed anew, fueled by classical rediscovery, philosophical curiosity, and an invigorated belief in the dignity of the human form. No longer confined to mere symbolism, sculpture emerged as a celebration of human potential, divine proportion, and intellectual clarity. This was not just a revival of technique, it was a renaissance of purpose. At the heart of Renaissance sculpture was humanism, a philosophical and cultural movement that emphasized the value of human beings, their reason, and their ability to shape the world. Inspired by the texts, ruins, and art of ancient Greece and Rome, Renaissance thinkers and artists believed that the human form, properly understood and rendered, was a reflection of divine order. This belief reinvigorated interest in anatomy, movement, and individual expression. Sculptors no longer carved generalized saints or anonymous martyrs. They sculpted individuals with unique features and inner life. The body was not a shell to be transcended, but a vessel of truth, worthy of study and celebration. To achieve this, artists began dissecting cadavers, measuring ancient statues, and experimenting with light, weight, and proportion. Marble, bronze, and terracotta became tools not of decoration, but of revelation, of what it meant to be human. The first great pioneer of Renaissance sculpture was Donatello, circa 1386 to 1466, a Florentine whose work spanned Gothic roots and classical rebirth. His sculptures exuded naturalism, psychological depth, and technical daring. His most famous work, the Bronze David, is remarkable on many fronts. It is the first freestanding nude male statue cast in bronze since antiquity, and it is a striking blend of youthful sensuality and heroic calm. David stands relaxed, 1 foot atop Goliath's severed head, a feather from the giant's helmet curling up his leg, a moment of victory depicted not with bombast, but with quiet assurance. Donatello's St. Mark and St. George reveal a similarly radical realism. His Mary Magdalene, carved from wood, shows a gaunt, aged figure, emaciated yet radiant, suffering yet holy. It was a new kind of sculpture, emotive, human, holy, without idealization. Equally revolutionary was Donatello's use of schiacciato, a technique of shallow relief carving that created illusionistic depth with minimal variation in surface. In his relief of the Feast of Herod, spatial depth, atmospheric perspective, and emotion intertwined seamlessly. Donatello's work was a bridge between eras, showing that sculpture could be intellectual, technical, and spiritual all at once. Around the same time, Lorenzo Ghiberti, 1378 to 1455, was transforming bronze relief with his famous doors for the Florence Baptistery. The second set, dubbed the Gates of Paradise by Michelangelo, depict 10 Old Testament scenes with astonishing clarity, narrative fluidity, and spatial illusion. Ghiberti's figures are elegant, classical, and idealized, but they are also individualized, moving through architectural spaces that draw on Roman models. His panels show an understanding of linear perspective, newly formalized by Brunelleschi and Alberti, and a love for graceful gesture. The doors were not just functional, they were theological theaters, where bronze became light and sacred stories unfolded with visual poetry. If Donatello broke the path and Ghiberti paved it, Michelangelo Buonarroti, 1475 to 1564, turned it into a road to the heavens. He regarded sculpture as the highest of the arts, because it involved liberating the form trapped within the stone, a divine act of creation. His David, carved from a single block of Carrara marble between 1501 and 1504, stands over 5 meters tall. It is not the youthful David of Donatello, but a heroic, tense, and alert David, poised before battle. Every sinew is taut, every vein visible. He is man and God, mortal and eternal, thought and action. Michelangelo's Pietà, housed in St. Peter's Basilica, shows the Virgin cradling the lifeless body of Christ. The composition is triangular, balanced, serene, yet full of sorrow. The marble seems to flow like fabric, pulse like flesh. It is both a study in form and a meditation on grief. Later, in his unfinished sculptures, like the Prisoners or the Awakening Slave, Michelangelo showed figures struggling to emerge from the marble. These works are metaphors for the soul wrestling with material, or the artist wrestling with form. They embody becoming rather than being. For Michelangelo, the act of sculpting was not merely manual labor, it was spiritual excavation. The hand of the artist was guided by something divine. The Renaissance reimagined sculpture's place in public life. In Florence, Rome, and Venice, city squares were adorned with statues that declared civic pride and human virtue. The Medici in Florence, the papacy in Rome, and wealthy merchants elsewhere sponsored sculptures for cathedrals, palaces, and fountains. Sculpture was no longer confined to the religious or funerary. It became political, philosophical, and cultural. The figure of David, for example, was not just a biblical hero. It was a symbol of Florence's defiance and independence. Even funerary monuments evolved into celebrations of legacy. The tombs of popes, princes, and poets became sculptural programs of allegory, theology, and personal myth. While Italy led the sculptural revival, the Northern Renaissance offered its own contributions. In places like Germany and the Low Countries, sculpture in wood flourished. Artists like Tillmann Riemenschneider and Veit Stoss carved expressive altarpieces filled with twisting figures, deep drapery, and intense emotion. Their works lacked the classical serenity of Italy, but they offered raw humanity, a reminder that the Renaissance took many forms. By the late 1500s, Mannerism and then the Baroque would transform Renaissance clarity into movement, drama, and theatricality. Yet the foundation laid by Renaissance sculpture, its reverence for the body, its embrace of antiquity, and its belief in art as a form of revelation, would endure. The Renaissance gave sculpture its voice again, no longer a servant to the symbolic or the spiritual alone. It became a chorus of form, feeling, and thought, one that continues to echo across time. As the Renaissance gave way to the 17th century, sculpture entered a new chapter, one defined not by the poised balance of Michelangelo or the serene harmony of classical ideals, but by passion, movement, and spectacle. This was the Baroque, a period in which sculpture aimed not to simply reflect the world, but to overwhelm it, immerse the viewer, and engage the senses in a powerful and often theatrical display. In this new era, the marble figure did not just stand. It acted. It turned, leapt, wept, soared, and suffered. Every curve, every gesture, every texture served a purpose, to provoke emotion and guide the soul. Baroque sculpture was born at the crossroads of counter-Reformation spirituality, royal ambition, and artistic innovation. Its masters, most notably Gian Lorenzo Bernini, created works that continue to astonish with their technical mastery and psychological depth. But the Baroque was not confined to Italy. It spread throughout Europe, adapting to the local tastes, politics, and religious tensions of each region. The Catholic Church, facing the Protestant Reformation, recognized the power of visual art to inspire devotion and convey religious truths. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, had called for religious art that was clear, instructive, and emotionally engaging. Sculpture became one of the Church's most effective tools. The ideal sculpture was no longer static or distant. It was narrative, immersive, and often interactive, pulling the viewer into the drama of faith. Light and shadow were manipulated to amplify mood. Drapery flowed like rivers. Muscles strained, eyes widened, mouths opened in ecstasy or agony. Baroque sculpture, more than ever, sought to transcend material. Though carved in stone or cast in bronze, the best works appeared alive, flesh made divine. No artist embodied the Baroque spirit more fully than Gian Lorenzo Bernini, 1598 to 1680. A prodigy in both sculpture and architecture, Bernini transformed the visual language of Europe and redefined what sculpture could express. His Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, 1647 to 52, located in the Cornaro Chapel in Rome, is one of the most famous examples of Baroque sculpture. It portrays the mystical vision of Saint Teresa of Avila, who described an angel piercing her heart with a golden spear, filling her with both divine pain and ecstasy. Bernini captures the scene with astonishing skill. Teresa reclines on a cloud, her body arched, her face radiant with spiritual rapture. The angel, delicate and serene, hovers above her, poised in the act. Hidden windows above bathe the figures in natural light, enhancing the illusion of transcendence. What makes the piece extraordinary is its total environment. Bernini designs not just the sculpture, but the entire chapel, with theatrical framing, colored marbles, and spectators carved into side niches, watching the miracle unfold. It is a stage set for faith, where sculpture becomes performance. Bernini's Apollo and Daphne, 1622 to 25, is another marvel. Based on Ovid's Metamorphoses, it captures the moment Daphne, fleeing Apollo's pursuit, transforms into a laurel tree. Her fingers sprout leaves, her toes root into the earth, bark crawls up her torso. The transformation is frozen in motion, rendered with such delicacy that marble seems to turn to flesh, wood, and wind. In David, 1623 to 24, Bernini contrasts Michelangelo's poised figure with one mid-action, bending, grimacing, muscles twisting as he prepares to launch his stone. The sculpture demands that the viewer walk around it. No single angle captures its intensity. It is sculpture as narrative climax. Bernini was not alone in the Baroque, but he set the tone, one of motion, emotion, and magnificence. The Baroque spirit swept through France, Spain, Germany, and the Low Countries, each region adapting its sculpture to local traditions and patronage. In France, artists like François Girardon and Pierre Puget combined classical restraint with dynamic movement. At Versailles, sculpture adorned the gardens, fountains, and halls with allegories of royal power, myth, and conquest. Louis XIV, the Sun King, understood sculpture as political spectacle. In Spain, sculpture often took on an intensely religious and visceral character. Wood was favored over marble, and the sculptures were polychromed, painted, with glass eyes, ivory teeth, and real fabric garments. Artists like Pedro de Mena and Gregorio Fernandez carved lifelike images of Christ, the Virgin, and martyrs, bleeding, suffering, yet radiant with holy dignity. These were not decorative objects. They were tools of devotion, paraded in Holy Week processions, kissed by the faithful, and revered as near miraculous. In Germany and Austria, the Baroque exploded into the Rococo, a lighter, more ornate style characterized by grace, whimsy, and abundance. Sculptors like Ignaz Günther created works filled with joy, playfulness, and emotional immediacy. In every region, Baroque sculpture aimed to move the soul, whether through awe, sorrow, joy, or reverence. One of the defining features of Baroque sculpture was its integration with architecture. Sculptures no longer stood apart as objects. They became part of altars, niches, staircases, fountains, and facades. This union created immersive environments. In churches, for example, angels floated overhead, saints leaned out from columns, and sculpted rays of gold seemed to burst from the heavens. The goal was not contemplation from afar. It was participation in the sacred drama. Fountains, too, became theatrical stages. Bernini's Fontana dei Quattro Fiumi, Fountain of the Four Rivers, in Rome, features personifications of major rivers, Danube, Nile, Ganges, and Rio de la Plata, reclining, twisting, and interacting with water, animals, and architecture. It's a global allegory, political symbol, and artistic marvel, all in one. By the 18th century, the Rococo style emerged in courtly circles, especially in France and Austria. Sculpture became lighter, more intimate, and often playful. Mythological scenes, flirtatious figures, cherubs, and ornamental forms dominated. Artists like Etienne Maurice Falconet created works such as The Bather, a delicate, idealized nude in a moment of shy modesty. Meanwhile, Clodion specialized in terracotta reliefs of Bacchic revelry, pastoral idylls, and flowing hair and garments. In Germany and Austria, sculptors like Georg Raphael Donner brought the Rococo into churches, blending elegance with sacred purpose. This period marked the final flowering of a tradition that would soon face rational critique and revolutionary change. Baroque and Rococo sculpture represented the height of technical mastery and emotional resonance. Yet by the late 18th century, critics began to see them as excessive, frivolous, or theatrical. The Enlightenment brought new values, reason, order, and moral clarity. The pendulum was ready to swing once again, this time toward neoclassicism. Still, the legacy of the Baroque remains profound. It showed that sculpture could not only capture form, but feeling, not only depict events, but invite participation. It set the stage for every modern sculptor who sought to combine craft with power, body with soul. The late 18th century ushered in a sweeping change in the cultural and intellectual life of Europe. In reaction to the extravagance and emotional excesses of the Baroque and Rococo, a new movement emerged, one rooted in clarity, simplicity, and rational beauty. This was the age of neoclassicism, a sculptural renaissance that looked not to the heart, but to the mind, not to theatrical drama, but to moral gravity. As Enlightenment ideals of reason, order, and civic virtue spread across Europe, sculpture became a vehicle for serious reflection, aesthetic restraint, and philosophical purpose. Fueling neoclassicism was a resurgence of interest in the art and architecture of ancient Greece and Rome, spurred by archaeological discoveries at Herculaneum, 1738, and Pompeii, 1748. These ruins offered more than buried cities. They revealed a forgotten aesthetic of balance, geometry, and restrained elegance. Scholars, artists, and wealthy patrons flocked to Italy, participating in the Grand Tour, studying classical ruins, reading ancient texts, and collecting antiquities. This reverence for the classical world was not purely academic. For Enlightenment thinkers, Greece and Rome symbolized rational government, civic responsibility, and heroic virtue, values believed to be essential for modern progress. Sculpture, in this context, became a means to educate, elevate, and inspire. Gone were the twisting figures and fluttering draperies of the Baroque. In their place stood calm, noble forms, often nude, modeled with anatomical precision, posed in stable contrapposto, and imbued with stoic dignity. The undisputed master of neoclassical sculpture was Antonio Canova, 1757 to 1822, an Italian sculptor whose works embodied the ideals of harmony, purity, and emotional restraint. Canova's sculptures were admired for their exquisite craftsmanship, smooth surfaces, and graceful serenity. His figures appear poised between life and eternity, imbued with an inner calm that invites contemplation rather than awe. One of his most celebrated works, Psyche Revived by Cupid's Kiss, shows the god gently lifting Psyche's limp body, her face tilted upward in awakening. Though deeply romantic in subject, the composition remains restrained, its emotion expressed through gesture and line, not facial drama. His Venus Victrix, a reclining nude of Pauline Bonaparte, Napoleon's sister, is sensuous yet idealized. Canova turned a contemporary woman into a classical goddess, blending reality and myth in polished marble. Canova also produced monumental tombs, such as those for Pope Clement XIV and Maria Christina of Austria, elegant compositions that conveyed loss with dignity, avoiding overt sentimentality. What distinguished Canova was his ability to channel emotion through form, without exaggeration. He respected the body as a vessel of ideal thought, rather than a theater of passion. While Canova championed mythological and religious themes, Jean-Antoine Houdon, 1741–1828, brought neoclassicism into the realm of portraiture. A French sculptor of unmatched precision, Houdon created lifelike busts of many Enlightenment figures, including Voltaire, Diderot, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson. Houdon's genius lay in his ability to capture not only physical features, but intellectual presence. His bust of Voltaire, for example, shows a wiry, aged man with a shrewd smile and twinkling eyes, alive with wit and skepticism. His Washington, portrayed in both military and civilian dress, is solemn, direct, and imbued with stoic republican virtue. These works were not mere likenesses. They were ideological portraits, expressing Enlightenment ideals of reason, character, and civic responsibility. As political revolutions swept through France, sculpture took on a more overtly ideological function. The revolutionaries, seeking to distance themselves from monarchy and church, turned to Roman republican imagery to construct a new civic iconography. Public spaces filled with statues of liberty, reason, and the people. Busts and monuments of revolutionary figures were modeled after Roman consuls and senators. Drapery replaced modern dress. The guillotine ended the lives of kings, but sculpture sought to immortalize the citizen. Some sculptors, like Jean-Baptiste Pigalle, portrayed Enlightenment philosophers. Others, like David d'Angers, memorialized revolutionary heroes. Art was now not only decorative, it was didactic, forming part of a visual republic. Neoclassical sculpture also played a central role in public architecture and memorials. As new governments and nation-states emerged, they used sculpture to express founding myths, national identity, and moral virtue. Arches, columns, fountains, and tombs were adorned with allegorical figures and narrative reliefs. The Arc de Triomphe in Paris, for example, though completed later, reflects neoclassical ideals, its sculptures depicting soldiers, battles, and personifications of victory with clarity and order. Sculpture had become part of the fabric of modern citizenship, a means of public education, collective memory, and national pride. Neoclassical sculptors returned to white marble as the noble medium of antiquity. The polished surface, devoid of paint, was seen as a sign of purity and timelessness, though ironically, most ancient statues had originally been polychromed. Bronze was also used, especially for monuments, though marble remained dominant in studio work. Tools and carving techniques evolved little from the Renaissance, but attention to surface finish and ideal proportion was intense. Display also changed. Museums and academies now played a central role in collecting, preserving, and exhibiting sculpture. Institutions like the Louvre, British Museum, and Vatican museums curated sculpture not only as art, but as history, an educational canon. By the early 19th century, cracks began to form in the neoclassical ideal. Critics argued that its clarity had become cold, its restraint lifeless. A new generation of sculptors began exploring individual emotion, contemporary subjects, and dynamic movement, laying the groundwork for romanticism and realism. Yet neoclassicism left a powerful legacy. It reasserted the centrality of the human figure, the importance of form and proportion, and the moral purpose of art. It connected sculpture to philosophy, politics, and the public sphere in ways that would shape modern life. Through the chisels of Canova and Houdin, the ideals of antiquity were not merely revived. They were reimagined for a new world, one where the mind ruled the passions, and the statue stood not as ornament, but as embodied reason. As the 19th century progressed, the aesthetic values that had defined neoclassicism, clarity, balance, ideal beauty, began to give way to a new artistic impulse, realism. Where the neoclassicists had sculpted gods and heroes, realists turned their gaze to ordinary people, contemporary life, and unfiltered truth. The age of industrial revolution, urbanization, and social upheaval demanded a new visual language, one grounded in reality, not myth. This transition from neoclassicism to realism was not a rejection of skill or form. It was a redefinition of meaning. Sculpture no longer had to depict timeless ideals. It could now explore the individual, the worker, the marginalized, and even the grotesque. This shift paved the way for the diversity and experimentation that would come to define modern sculpture. The pivotal figure in this transformation was Auguste Rodin, 1840 to 1917, widely regarded as the father of modern sculpture. His work bridged the gap between traditional techniques and modern sensibilities, emphasizing emotion, movement, and psychological depth over ideal form. Rodin's early masterpiece, The Age of Bronze, 1877, shocked critics with its lifelike quality. So precise was its modeling that he was accused of having cast it directly from a live model. In truth, Rodin had painstakingly modeled every detail by hand, but the realism was so radical for its time, it was deemed unnerving. Rodin rejected the polished finish and calm detachment of neoclassicism. His surfaces were textured, unfinished, even raw. His figures emerged from the marble or bronze, as if in the process of becoming, caught in mid-thought or motion. His The Thinker, originally part of the Gates of Hell, became an icon of introspection and existential struggle. Unlike the serene philosopher of antiquity, Rodin's Thinker is muscular, hunched, burdened, wrestling with his thoughts as much as pondering them. The Burghers of Calais, 1889, a monumental group sculpture, commemorates the self-sacrifice of 6 citizens during the 100 Years' War. But rather than heroic posturing, Rodin presents them in emotional turmoil, some despairing, some resigned, some defiant. The realism lies not in anatomical accuracy, but in emotional truth. Rodin changed sculpture forever by making inner life visible. He proved that stone could bleed, that bronze could tremble, that form could reflect the fractured psyche of the modern world. The 19th century was also the age of industry and empire, and sculpture adapted accordingly. Public monuments proliferated, equestrian statues, commemorative busts, allegorical figures, celebrating national heroes, scientific progress, and imperial power. Cities filled with statues of generals, statesmen, explorers, and industrialists. Iron and steel, cast bronze, and machined stone enabled new scales of production and display. Yet within this surge of civic pride, sculptors also began to explore the underbelly of modern life. They portrayed workers, peasants, the urban poor, not in caricature, but with empathy. Artists like Jules Dalou, Constantin Meunier, and Medardo Rosso shifted attention away from mythology and nobility toward labor, aging, and fragility. Rosso's wax and plaster portraits, in particular, dissolved the boundary between form and atmosphere, his faces melting into light, shadow, and air. This was not realism as mere documentation. It was poetic observation, grounded in life. The 19th century also saw the emergence of prominent women sculptors who challenged both artistic and societal norms. Camille Claudel, a student and collaborator, and later tragic lover of Rodin, produced emotionally powerful works that rivaled his in intensity and form. Her The Waltz and The Age of Maturity expressed themes of love, separation, and loss. not as allegory, but as personal truth. Others, like Harriet Hosmer, Anne Whitney, and Edmonia Lewis, the first African-American and Native American woman to gain international recognition as a sculptor, created works that addressed gender, race, and identity within classical frameworks, asserting presence in a world that often denied it. Their works were not only aesthetically powerful, they were also acts of resistance, claiming a place for new narratives in a historically exclusive medium. As the 20th century dawned, sculpture once again found itself in a moment of revolution. The rise of abstraction, cubism, and modernism shattered traditional assumptions about form, perspective, and representation. Artists began asking radical questions. What if sculpture did not have to resemble anything at all? What if a form could evoke rather than depict? What if mass, space, texture, and void were equal participants in meaning? Pioneers like Constantin Brancusi, 1876–1957, sought the essence of form, reducing figures to their geometric, symbolic cores. His bird in space is not a bird in any literal sense, but the idea of flight, embodied in a sleek, ascending curve of polished bronze. Brancusi's Sleeping Muse and the Kiss reimagined the human face and embrace, not with anatomical precision, but with metaphysical quiet. His workshop in Paris became a temple of minimalism and meditation. Other sculptors, like Jacques Lipchitz and Alexander Archipenko, applied Cubist principles to sculpture, fragmenting and reassembling the body into planes and perspectives. This was a new language, sculpture as concept, not just object. Modern sculptors also embraced new materials: steel, glass, found objects, plastic, and even light. The boundaries between sculpture, architecture, and design blurred. Naum Gabo and Antoine Pevsner, pioneers of constructivism, created dynamic forms using wire, acrylic, and transparency. Sculpture not as solid mass, but as space, motion, and energy. Jean Arp introduced biomorphic abstraction, soft, organic shapes that seemed to have grown, not been carved. His forms suggested life without imitation, rhythms without anatomy. Barbara Hepworth and Henry Moore redefined monumentality in the mid-20th century, carving massive pierced forms that felt both ancient and futuristic, echoes of landscape, bone, and shelter. Hepworth's serene sculptures suggested communion with nature and introspection, while Moore's reclining figures, often female, were landscapes unto themselves, bodies as terrain, voids as presence. Modern sculpture had become not just a reflection of the world, but a reimagining of it. As the 20th century progressed and gave way to the 21st, sculpture underwent its most radical transformation yet, not in material or technique alone, but in philosophy, intent, and definition. What was once bound to stone, bronze, or wood became a field of limitless possibility. The contemporary sculptor is not just a carver or modeler, but a thinker, an assembler, a performer, a provocateur. Contemporary sculpture is no longer confined to pedestals or galleries. It spills into public squares, hangs from ceilings, fills entire rooms, and stretches across landscapes. It moves, sounds, decays, breathes. It asks, not simply, what is beautiful, but what matters, and what does it mean to exist, to remember, to resist, to belong. In this final chapter, we examine how contemporary sculpture has expanded beyond form to engage with ideas, identities, politics, and the viewer's own presence. It is a story not just of artistic evolution, but of cultural reckoning and existential exploration. In the 1960s and 70s, a seismic shift occurred. Influenced by the rise of conceptual art, many artists began to treat sculpture not as an object to be admired, but as a vehicle for ideas. The focus shifted from craftsmanship to context, from permanence to process. Joseph Beuys, for example, used everyday materials like felt, fat, and copper to symbolize memory, trauma, healing, and transformation. His social sculptures were not fixed forms, but acts of participation, suggesting that society itself could be molded like clay. Eva Hesse used latex, rope, and fiberglass to create fragile, haunting installations that spoke of bodily vulnerability, psychological tension, and impermanence. Her work was sculptural, but anti-monumental, asserting softness and instability in a field long dominated by hardness and durability. Robert Smithson, with his spiral jetty, 1970, brought sculpture into the landscape itself, creating earthworks that merged geology, entropy, and time. His work could not be hung on a wall. It lived in the world, shaped by natural forces as much as human intent. Contemporary sculpture often immerses the viewer. No longer separate from us, it surrounds, invites, implicates. Artists like Anish Kapoor, Olafur Eliasson, and Yayoi Kusama create environments in which sculpture is inseparable from light, space, and perception. Kapoor's Cloud Gate, 2006, in Chicago, is a massive mirrored form that reflects and distorts the skyline and the viewer, a monument to reflection in every sense. Its surface invites touch, play, contemplation. It's not just seen, it's experienced. Eliasson's works, like the Weather Project, fill entire rooms with mist, mirrors, and artificial suns, transforming museums into sensory landscapes. Viewers become part of the sculpture, their shadows and breath merging with the work. Kusama's infinity mirror rooms offer repetition, light, and boundlessness. The body is multiplied, dwarfed, enveloped. Her installations explore themes of obsession, mental illness, femininity, and the infinite self. In this era, sculpture is encounter, process, presence. In our global, post-colonial, and increasingly pluralistic world, sculpture has become a platform for identity and resistance. Artists use the medium to confront issues of race, gender, migration, colonialism, and belonging. Kara Walker creates monumental silhouettes and sculptures that subvert the aesthetics of classical monuments, exposing the violence and sexual exploitation underpinning American history. Her work forces a reckoning with the legacy of slavery, power, and the representation of black bodies. Ella Natsui, working with discarded bottle caps and aluminum, weaves massive tapestry-like sculptures that reference both Ghanaian textiles and global consumerism. His work blurs the line between sculpture and textile, past and present, trash and treasure. Ai Weiwei, the Chinese dissident artist, uses sculpture to challenge authoritarianism, censorship, and historical amnesia. His installation, Sunflower Seeds, 2010, filled the Tate Modern with 100 million hand-painted porcelain seeds, each one a symbol of mass production, individuality, and political silence. These artists don't just sculpt objects, they sculpt narratives, histories, and ideologies. Contemporary sculpture embraces digital tools, biomaterials, light, sound, and motion. 3D printing, robotic carving, and virtual reality have become part of the sculptor's arsenal. Patricia Piccinini creates hyper-realistic sculptures of human-animal hybrids using silicone and fiberglass, challenging our definitions of life, compassion, and the post-human. Theo Jansen's wind-powered strand beasts, kinetic sculptures made of PVC, walk across beaches like living organisms, entirely mechanical, yet eerily lifelike. Even data itself has become sculptural. Artists now translate information, climate statistics, social media feeds, brainwaves, into forms and environments that make the invisible tangible. Sculpture is no longer just an object. It is an interface, a system, a world. In recent years, sculpture has also become a battleground for public memory. Statues of historical figures, once seen as timeless, are now sites of contestation, protest, and reinterpretation. The toppling of Confederate monuments in the United States, the removal of colonial statues in the UK and Europe, and the global re-evaluation of public art have sparked a profound conversation. Who do we memorialize? What stories do our statues tell? Can a sculpture heal or only commemorate? Artists are responding with counter-monuments, works that mourn, question, or refuse permanence. Rachel Whitered's Nameless Library in Vienna, a sculpture commemorating the Austrian Holocaust victims, takes the form of a sealed library turned inside out, books that can never be read. Others, like Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial, combine minimalism with deep emotional resonance, using names, silence, and space to evoke reflection. In this context, sculpture is not a conclusion, it is a question. As we look to the future, sculpture continues to evolve. It is increasingly global, drawing from multiple cultural traditions and voices, interdisciplinary, merging with science, performance, activism, and design, responsive, engaging with the climate crisis, social justice, and mental health, ephemeral, accepting impermanence as a condition of our time. Contemporary sculpture resists easy categorization. It is at once the body and its absence, the material and the invisible, the past and the possibility. It no longer seeks only to stand. It seeks to transform, provoke, heal, and connect. In the chisel's echo, the bronze's gleam, the void of a gallery space, the wind that powers a sculpture's legs, and the digital file rendered in space, we find sculpture not as a static tradition, but as a living dialogue. Across centuries, cultures, and the endless boundaries of imagination.